Little Fox.
The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Introduction.
What do you think of Tom Sawyer?
Asked a reporter from a St. Louis newspaper.
He's a rascal,
Said the older woman sharply.
Finding that gold was just so unfortunate. Ma'am, don't you mean fortunate?
Asked the reporter, confused.
No, I mean unfortunate.
Said the woman.
It's unfortunate that such a mischievous boy found the gold.
The reporter had interviewed 10 different people about Tom Sawyer, and she had gotten 10 different descriptions of the same boy. She truly did not understand what was going on. What the reporter didn't know was that Tom Sawyer was not a single boy at all. His character was based on a collection of boys who Samuel Clemens had known when he was growing up in Hannibal, Missouri. Samuel Clemens is best known as Mark Twain, the author of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. If the reporter had asked Mark Twain about Tom Sawyer, she would have learned that Tom is a smart boy, but not book smart. She would have learned that Tom is a good boy, but not church good. In other words, Tom is a completely ordinary child, except for his adventures. Tom's parents are dead, and Tom is an orphan. His mother's sister Polly has taken him into her house. Tom's world is the fictional town called Petersburg, Missouri. Most of Tom's friends lead fairly normal lives, with the exception, of course, of Huckleberry Finn. Huck, as he is called, is the son of a drunk. Tom, however, sees Huck as a friend who has all the luck, a boy who doesn't have to go to either school or church. Tom meets a new girl in town named Becky and wins her affection. She wins Tom's heart too, and some of his adventures happen because of her. She brings out a sensitive side of mischievous Tom. Mark Twain's novel is a classic story about a boy. Tom's youth, independence, and bright curiosity still charm many readers today. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 1, Cheeky Tom.
Tom?
Yelled Aunt Polly. There was no answer.
Tom!
She shouted again.
Where is that boy?
She muttered. Aunt Polly looked everywhere for her young nephew, but he was nowhere to be found. He wasn't in his bedroom. He wasn't in the yard, and he wasn't in the kitchen. Aunt Polly knew that if she couldn't see Tom, he was probably getting into trouble. Tom was an orphan, and he loved mischief and adventure. But sometimes he was too mischievous.
When I find you, I'll give you a spanking!
Aunt Polly shouted. Then she grabbed the broom.
Where on earth has that boy gone?
Aunt Polly said to herself.
Tom!
She screamed. Her glasses fell to the tip of her long, narrow nose. As she pushed the glasses back up, she spied something moving under the bed.
I've got you now, boy.
Aunt Polly took the broom handle and quickly pushed it under the bed. She wasn't surprised when she struck something, but it wasn't Tom. Instead, her cat sprang out from under the bed with an angry howl. Just then, Aunt Polly heard footsteps behind her, and she turned to see Tom sneaking out of the closet. Aunt Polly grabbed the boy by his shirt and gave him a quick shake and a long look. His hands were filthy, and he was grinning from ear to ear.
What were you doing in the closet?
Asked Aunt Polly.
Nothing,
Said Tom sheepishly.
Nothing!
Shouted Aunt Polly.
Look at your hands! Look at your mouth! Why are you so filthy?
I don't know.
Said Tom innocently.
Well, I know.
Said his aunt.
It's jam, and I've told you 100 times to leave that jam alone. Go back into the closet and get me my stick.
Tom gave Aunt Polly the willow stick reluctantly.
I'm really in trouble now.
Thought Tom. As Aunt Polly raised the stick, Tom shouted,
Look behind you! What's that?
Aunt Polly turned to look, and in a flash, Tom ran out the door and jumped over the fence.
Oh, darn that boy.
Aunt Polly sighed, and then she began to laugh.
When will I learn? He's played that trick on me 1,000 times. People say an old fool is the biggest fool, and they're right. I should know all his tricks by now.
Aunt Polly worried about Tom. She wanted him to become a good man, but he got into too much trouble and skipped a lot of school.
If I find out that boy has skipped school again, I'll have to punish him,
she said to herself.
Spare the rod and spoil the child, as the Bible says. I know the Bible is right because that boy is a very sinful creature. It's all my fault because I don't like to beat him.
While Aunt Polly was blaming herself for Tom's faults, Tom was preparing to celebrate his mischief.
I deserve a vacation.
Thought Tom.
After all, I made Aunt Polly believe that something was actually behind her for the 1,000th time. And they just don't teach you useful tricks like that at school.
So Tom skipped school, and he had a very good time. Tom got home just in time to help Jim with his chores. Jim was the young slave who helped Aunt Polly with the housework. Tom entertained Jim with the tales of his adventures. Tom's half-brother, Sid, listened too because he had already finished his chores. Sid was the opposite of Tom in almost every way. At dinner, Aunt Polly wanted to punish Tom for eating the jam and fooling her with his old trick. So she asked Tom many questions, hoping to catch him in a lie.
Tom, it was quite warm at school today, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, ma'am. It was very warm,
answered Tom.
Didn't you want to swim in the river?
Asked Aunt Polly. Tom nervously looked at Aunt Polly's face, but it told him nothing. He said,
I did want to go swimming, but I had to go to school.
Aunt Polly felt Tom's shirt collar. It was dry, and for a minute she just stared at Tom.
The dry collar is a trick I've used 1,000,000 times, but she's never figured it out,
thought Tom. He tried to hide his smile as he watched his aunt's face carefully. Was Aunt Polly about to punish him, or had he fooled her once again? The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 2, Tom at Work. Tom knew his aunt wanted to catch him in a lie, so he said,
Ma'am, I was so hot today that I dumped water from the well on my head. See? My hair is still wet.
Aunt Polly was annoyed that she had overlooked Tom's wet hair.
He skipped school again,
she thought. She decided to use her secret weapon. Before school each morning, she sewed Tom's collar shut with thread.
Tom, show me your shirt collar,
said Aunt Polly sternly. If he had taken off his shirt to go swimming, she would see the broken thread and know. Aunt Polly was really surprised because the collar was still sewn shut.
Tom, I'm sorry I suspected you of skipping school today. It appears that I was wrong,
said Aunt Polly. Tom accepted her apology gracefully. He was just about to leave when Sid said,
Didn't you sew Tom's collar with white thread this morning? Look here.
He pointed at Tom's shirt.
Tom's collar is sewn with black thread.
Why, yes, I did sew it with white thread today,
said Aunt Polly thoughtfully, and then her face changed. It turned red, her glasses slipped to the tip of her nose, and she screamed.
Boy, that's it!
Tom turned to Sid and said menacingly,
I'll beat you good for that,
he growled. Not wanting to hear what his punishment would be, he ran out the door.
I'll have to punish him tomorrow,
said Aunt Polly to herself.
I'll make him work. He hates work, but I've got to teach him a lesson.
Tom sat down under a tree. In the fading light, he examined the 2 needles he kept under the front collar of his shirt. One needle had white thread, and the other had black.
Aunt Polly never would have noticed the thread if it hadn't been for Sid,
moaned Tom.
Darn it! I bet she'll make me work tomorrow, and tomorrow is Saturday.
Tom was in a foul mood. He spent the rest of the evening planning his revenge on Sid. The next day, Tom stood on the sidewalk with a paint bucket and a brush. He looked at the fence. It was 90 feet long and 9 feet high, and he had to spend his whole Saturday painting it. He dipped his brush into the bucket and painted the first plank. Then he stopped.
This will take forever.
He sighed. Suddenly, Tom saw his friend Ben coming down the street. Tom picked up the brush and began painting again because he had a plan. Ben walked up to Tom.
Working, huh? I'm going swimming. Don't you wish you could come?
I'm not working.
Replied Tom.
Yes, you are,
Said Ben.
Well, maybe it is working, but I like it.
Said Tom.
What?
Shouted Ben.
You like it?
Tom kept painting and said,
Boys don't get to paint a fence every day.
Ben watched Tom paint for a while. The fence looked clean and white. Ben watched some more, and soon he started to think.
Painting looks easy. Painting looks fun.
Before long, Ben really wanted to paint too.
Let me try.
He begged Tom.
No,
Said Tom.
Aunt Polly told me to do it. She said it was important. This is the street side of the fence. Only one boy in 1,000 has the talent to paint the street side.
Tom paused and pretended to think for a moment.
Maybe you can do the backside.
He said.
I'll let you have my apple.
Ben offered. Tom looked at Ben, and then he looked at the apple. He handed Ben the brush. While Ben painted, Tom rested in the shade. He ate the apple and smiled. His plan had worked. Soon other boys came and asked to paint too. By early afternoon, both sides of the fence were finished, and Tom's pockets were full of presents.
May I play now?
Tom called to his aunt.
You can't be finished already. How much of the fence have you painted?
She asked.
All of it. Come and see.
Said Tom.
Don't you lie to me.
Began Aunt Polly. Just then she spotted the freshly painted fence. She was so pleased with its clean appearance, she gave Tom a shiny red apple. Then she sent him off to play. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 3, The New Girl. After seeing the freshly painted fence, Aunt Polly decided to let Tom play outdoors for the rest of the afternoon. The first thing Tom wanted to do was get revenge on Sid for telling Aunt Polly about his collar. So Tom waited by the fence and ambushed his half-brother with balls made of dried-up mud. Before Aunt Polly could rush to Sid's rescue, Tom managed to hit him with 6 or 7 balls. Sid screamed in fear and pain. Then Tom jumped over the fence and was gone. When Tom arrived at the town square a few minutes later, a group of boys was already there, ready to play army games. Tom and his best friend, Joe Harper, were appointed as generals, and they commanded their armies all afternoon. As the sun began to set, the boys counted their dead and wounded, and it was determined that Tom had won a great battle. Joe and Tom shook hands and agreed to meet next Saturday for another battle. On his way home, Tom spied a new girl. He thought the new girl was lovely, with blue eyes and braided blonde hair. At the sight of this new angel, the love Tom had pledged to a girl named Amy Lawrence instantly vanished. Tom soon began to show off for the new girl. He balanced a stick on his nose, and he walked up and down the street where they both lived. When the girl reached her house, she halted and looked over at Tom for only a second, but it was enough to encourage Tom. After she went inside, Tom lingered near her house, hoping to see her one more time, but the pretty new girl never reappeared. Still, Tom returned home in high spirits. His aunt scolded him for throwing mud balls at Sid, but Tom didn't care. When his aunt hit him for stealing sugar from the sugar bowl, Tom didn't care. He just smiled and said,
You never hit Sid when he takes sugar.
Sid doesn't torment me the way you do,
she reminded him. That night, Tom went to bed with a new girl on his mind. He was determined to devise a way to get her to notice him. The next morning, Aunt Polly forced Tom to put on his Sunday suit for church. After a quick breakfast, she escorted Tom to church to make sure he attended Sunday school. The day's lesson consisted of memorizing 5 verses of the Bible, but Tom was having a problem concentrating. At last, the lesson ended, and Tom and the other students had a 15-minute break before the church service began. Although Tom had not bothered to memorize the 5 verses, he had finally devised a plan to make the new girl interested in him. The other children had paid Tom to let them paint, so now his pockets overflowed with marbles, candies, fish hooks, and other goodies. Tom decided to use his new wealth to buy verse recitation tickets. These tickets were rewards for students who correctly recited verses from the Bible. For every 2 lines of verse correctly recited, students were given 1 blue ticket. 10 blue tickets equaled 1 red ticket. 10 red tickets equaled 1 yellow ticket. For 10 yellow tickets, a student could earn a Bible. A Bible for reciting 2,000 lines of verse. Only older students were able to earn a Bible because it took years of saving tickets. Tom didn't want a Bible, but he did want to win the new girl's heart. To win her heart, he had decided that he must seem like a better person than the other boys. In church, the moment to impress the new girl finally came. First, the minister asked all the smartest and most studious children how many tickets they had. None of them had enough for a Bible yet.
"Does anyone have enough tickets for a Bible?"
asked the minister. To the shock of everyone, Tom stood up. Then he proudly marched forward to bring his tickets to the minister. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 4, Tom and Becky's Engagement. When the minister saw Tom walking forward to receive the Bible, he was shocked. The minister could not imagine how Tom had mastered 2,000 lines of verse. But the boys and girls sitting there knew. They had sold their tickets for the sake of Tom's glory. After Tom received his Bible, he was introduced to the judge, the new girl's father.
"What's your name?"
asked the judge.
Thomas,
stuttered a very nervous Tom.
"You're a fine boy, Thomas, and 2,000 verses is a lot of verses. You won't be sorry you learned them,"
said the judge. Tom thought he was free to go, but then the judge continued.
"Knowledge is precious. It's what makes good men great, and I can see you'll be a great man. I'm sure you know the names of all of Jesus' disciples, but who were his first 2 disciples?"
Tom was uncertain if he was supposed to answer, so he remained quiet.
"Thomas, answer the question,"
the minister prodded him. At that, Tom shouted out the only 2 names from the Bible he could remember.
David and Goliath.
The church erupted into laughter. Tom slunk back to his seat. His aunt poked him angrily. The next morning, Tom woke up knowing it was Monday, and Monday meant school. Tom hated school more than he hated work, and this Monday was no different. He was feeling especially sheepish after his fall from grace at the church. But at school, he would see the new girl. School would be bearable. On the way to school, Tom met his friend Huck. Huck's father was a drunk, so Huck was the only boy in town who didn't have to go to church or school.
Hey, Huck,
said Tom. He noticed that his friend was holding something.
What have you got?
Something that will cure warts,
said Huck.
I have lots of warts,
said Tom.
Come with me to the graveyard tonight, and I can get rid of them for you,
said Huck. Tom thought that was a good idea. Tom and Huck said goodbye, and Tom continued walking to school. By the time Tom finally got to school, he was late.
Where have you been?
The teacher asked. Tom usually made up a story when he was late, but today was different. If he told the teacher the truth, he would be punished by being made to sit with the girls. He saw that the only empty seat was beside the new girl. His punishment would be to sit next to her.
I was talking with Huckleberry Finn,
answered Tom. The teacher was shocked.
Thomas Sawyer, that boy is bad, and you should not talk with bad boys.
Tom apologized, and the teacher made him sit next to the new girl. Tom saw the winks and heard the whispers of the other boys and girls, but he didn't care. He was happy that his plan had worked, and he pretended to read. Tom put a peach on the new girl's desk. Tom then wrote on his slate, "Please take it, I have more." The girl read the slate and quickly looked away. Soon Tom began to draw, and with his left hand he hid what he was drawing.
Let me see,
The girl whispered.
I wish I could draw.
She said when Tom finally showed her.
It's easy.
Said Tom.
Stay for lunch and I'll teach you. What's your name?
I'm Becky Thatcher. What's your... Oh, I know. I remember you from church. You're Thomas Sawyer.
They only call me that when I'm bad.
Said Tom.
You can call me Tom.
Tom wrote some words on his slate, and again he hid them from Becky. She begged to see them. Tom whispered,
Promise you won't tell.
I promise.
Said Becky. Tom moved his hand and Becky read the words.
I love you. Oh, you're bad.
She blushed and turned away, but Tom saw her smiling and he knew she was pleased. At lunch, Tom and Becky met behind the schoolhouse, and Tom asked Becky a question.
Have you ever been engaged?
No.
Replied Becky.
Would you like to be?
Asked Tom.
Maybe. What's special about it?
Well,
Said Tom.
first we kiss, and then you only like me, and I only like you. And we walk to and from school together.
Becky thought it sounded nice, so she said,
I love you.
in Tom's ear.
I never thought I'd be engaged.
Said Becky, smiling.
It's fun.
Said Tom.
Amy and I...
Oh, Tom, you've been engaged before.
Shouted Becky, and she began to cry. Tom tried to comfort her, but she wouldn't listen. She was hurt and angry.
I only care for you.
Said Tom, and he left. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 5, Murder at Midnight. Tom was lying awake in the dark in the bedroom he shared with Sid. He couldn't understand Becky's anger. Suddenly, he heard a familiar
Meow!
coming from outside. As planned, Huck had arrived at Tom's house a little before midnight, and he'd given the secret call. Tom meowed back. Tom climbed out his bedroom window and joined Huck on the street. The two boys then hurried to the graveyard to cure their warts. The graveyard was on a hill about 1.5 miles from the town. It was quiet except for the wind whistling through the trees.
Here is Hoss's grave,
Said Huck.
Shouldn't we call him Mr. Williams?
Asked Tom. Tom wasn't sure if it was polite for kids to call a dead man by his first name.
You're right.
Said Huck.
The dead should be respected.
What do we use to cure our warts?
Asked Tom.
Indian herbs, and they're over there.
Said Huck, pointing to a large tree. Tom followed Huck over to the large tree. Suddenly, Tom and Huck heard muffled voices. The boys froze, sure that the voices belonged to dead spirits who were angry.
I've heard that spirits can see in the dark, like cats.
Whispered Huck.
What should we do?
There was a light, and the voices grew louder.
Huck, they're not spirits. They're people.
Whispered Tom.
And I know them. One is Muff Potter, another is Injun Joe, and there's Doc Robinson.
Tom and Huck hid in the shadow of the big tree and watched.
Hurry, man.
Said Doc Robinson.
The moon might come out.
Muff Potter and Injun Joe began digging as Doc Robinson held the lantern. It didn't take long before one of the shovels hit the coffin. Muff and Injun Joe used their shovels to open the coffin.
You better give us another $5,
Said Muff Potter.
or the body stays here.
The doctor was angry.
Look here.
he said.
I paid you in advance.
Injun Joe approached him and said,
Your father put me in jail, and I swore I'd get even. Did you think I'd forget?
Injun Joe threatened the doctor with his fist. Doc Robinson slowly put the lantern down and then turned suddenly and hit Injun Joe in the face. Muff ran to help his friend, but he was too drunk to hurt Doc Robinson. Muff took a swing at the doctor, missed, and lost his balance. Doc Robinson picked up a rock and hit the stumbling Muff on the head. As Muff fell to the ground, Injun Joe pulled out a knife and drove it into the doctor's chest. Injun Joe then took the knife and put it in Muff Potter's hand. Finally, he robbed Doc Robinson's dead body. The boys couldn't believe what they had seen. The graveyard was an evil place, and they ran from it. In the dark, the boys thought for sure that the spirits of the dead were chasing them.
We've got to make it to the old barn!
Shouted Tom between breaths. There was no answer. Huck could only gasp for breath. The boys kept running, and soon they burst through the open barn door.
Huck, what's going to happen?
Asked Tom.
Doc Robinson is dead, so there will be a hanging.
Replied Huck.
And if Injun Joe finds out we saw, he'll kill us for sure.
There will be a hanging only if we tell,
Said Tom.
Muff was knocked out. He didn't see what happened.
Tom, that's it.
Said Huck.
If we swear to keep quiet, Injun Joe won't kill us.
It was almost morning when Tom got home and crawled into bed. Huck had no home to go to, so he slept inside an empty barrel. The next morning, everyone heard the news that the doctor was dead. A public hearing was scheduled, and the sheriff and mayor asked people what they knew. Both Muff Potter and Injun Joe were questioned. Muff said he was too drunk to remember what happened, but he admitted going to the graveyard to rob the grave. When Injun Joe was questioned, he said that it was Muff who had killed the doctor. So the sheriff took Muff Potter to jail, and Injun Joe remained free. Huck and Tom couldn't believe that Injun Joe could tell such lies, and Tom often had nightmares. He dreamed of the murder and of Injun Joe coming after him in his dreams. Later, Tom remembered that he and Huck had left something behind in the graveyard, the bag of Indian herbs. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 6, The Right Medicine. Soon, Tom stopped worrying about the murder because he had something else to worry about, Becky. She was sick, and Tom thought she might die. Tom was so worried about Becky that he stopped playing with his friends. One day, Tom waited outside Becky's house, hoping to see her. When he didn't spot her at all, he was sad. Aunt Polly worried about Tom, too. To make Tom feel better, she tried lots of new remedies that she read about in a woman's magazine. One remedy was giving Tom a cold bath every evening. Afterward, Aunt Polly would wrap him in many layers of blankets until he began to sweat. The treatment didn't help. It only made Tom quieter and sadder. Next, Aunt Polly talked to her friends, and they recommended a medicine made from chili peppers. Aunt Polly decided to try it on Tom. She gave Tom a teaspoon of the medicine and watched his face. Tom's mouth, throat, and stomach felt as if they were on fire. He screamed and ran around the room. Aunt Polly was pleased because Tom was finally acting like himself again. She told Tom that if he didn't feel better tomorrow, she'd give him more medicine. Tom quickly decided to be less sad. Tom wondered what else the medicine could cure. The cat, for example, was suffering from laziness. The medicine had made Tom more active, so maybe it would make the cat more active too. Tom gave some hot chili pepper medicine to the cat. The cat leaped into the air, screamed, and ran around and around the room. He knocked over chairs, plants, and bookshelves. Tom thought it was the funniest thing he had ever seen. Aunt Polly came into the room just as the cat jumped out the window.
What's wrong with the cat?
Asked Aunt Polly. Tom was laughing too hard to answer. Aunt Polly saw the teaspoon and the medicine bottle on the floor.
How How could you treat the cat like that?
She asked sternly. Tom said,
The cat's been lazy, and you don't love him enough, so I felt sorry for him. I decided to love the cat like you love me. I gave him some medicine.
Tom's words made Aunt Polly feel bad. She hadn't meant to be unloving, so she apologized. She explained she only wanted Tom to feel better. Tom smiled and said,
I know you meant well, and it worked. I think the medicine helped the cat too. I've never seen him move so fast.
Tom was still smiling about the cat when he got to school, but his amusement soon turned to delight. Becky was back. Tom tried everything to get Becky's attention. He jumped over the fence, he walked on his hands, he even did cartwheels off the school steps. But Becky was still mad about Tom being engaged to Amy first. Ignoring Tom, she turned to a friend and said loudly,
Some people think they're so smart, always showing off.
Tom was so angry that he ran into the woods. There, he met his friend Joe Harper. Joe was angry too. His mother had punished him for something he didn't do. Tom had an idea.
Let's run away. That will make them sorry.
Joe agreed and said he would like to live on an island. Tom and Joe were planning their new lives when they met Huck. Huck was also dissatisfied with his life. People didn't like him because his father was a drunk. Huck thought running away sounded fun. Huck helped Tom and Joe steal some food and find a log raft. Together they pushed the raft into the Mississippi River and headed for Jackson Island. Once on the island, the boys became pirates. They took turns being their favorite pirate, and they had great battles on both land and sea.
Life as a pirate is great,
said Huck.
I haven't had this much fun in ages.
The other two boys agreed,
We should explore the island,
said Joe.
We should look for buried treasure,
shouted Tom. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the island and looking for buried treasure. Being a pirate was hard work, and by early evening they were tired and hungry.
It's time to build our camp,
said Tom.
I think I saw some sailcloth snagged on a log,
said Joe.
That will make an excellent tent,
said Huck. They made a tent, cooked their food, talked around the fire, and went to sleep. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 7, Life as a Pirate. Tom woke up first, and he wondered where he was. Then he remembered he was a pirate on Jackson Island. The dawn was cool and gray, and there were dewdrops on the grass. Their campfire was almost out, only smoke rose from the ashes. Tom woke the other boys up, and they went for a swim in the river. They came back to camp happy and refreshed. They restarted the campfire. Joe made hickory tea, and Huck and Tom both caught some fish. After a delicious fish fry breakfast, Tom said,
Let's really find that buried treasure.
Huck and Joe were eager to follow. They looked in less obvious places, inside hollow logs and under the roots of old trees. Soon the boys were hot, so they took another swim. Although they hadn't found any treasure, the boys were too happy to care. Even without a treasure, the boys felt rich. The island seemed like a large kingdom to them. However, after a second failed treasure hunt, the boys began to feel a kind of homesickness growing inside them. Tom and Joe missed their families, and all three missed their friends. During lunch, the boys heard a loud noise coming from up the river.
What's that?
Asked Joe.
Can't be thunder,
Said Huck. Shh, said Tom.
Listen.
The boys listened, and soon they heard another boom,
Let's see what's making that noise,
said Tom. The boys watched a ferry chugging its way slowly down the river. First, they saw a burst of black smoke from the ferry's deck, and then they heard boom again.
I know!
Shouted Tom.
Somebody's drowned!
Yes,
Said Huck.
they did this last summer when Bill Turner drowned. They're shooting cannonballs into the water to make the body come up.
Really?
said Joe.
I wonder who's drowned.
The boys continued to watch and listen. Then Tom said suddenly,
I know who's drowned. It's us.
You're right.
agreed Huck,
We're heroes!
said Joe. The boys were pleased because they knew they were missed. They also knew that they must be the talk of the town. Being a pirate was wonderful. By evening, the ferry had stopped searching. The boys ate supper around the campfire, and they tried to guess what people were saying about them. Tom thought about Aunt Polly, and Joe thought about his mother,
Maybe it's time to go back.
said Joe softly. Although Tom and Huck were thinking the same thing, they both said they didn't want to go home. Tom couldn't sleep. He decided to leave his aunt a message. He wrote a note on a piece of bark and then rowed the raft down the river and back into town. When he got to his house, he saw that the lights were still on. Aunt Polly was talking to Joe's mother. Tom sneaked into the house and hid under a bed. From under the bed, Tom could see and hear everything.
What's making the candle flicker?
Asked Aunt Polly. She looked and saw the door was open,
Strange things are happening here.
said Joe's mother. Tom could see that her eyes were red and she had been crying,
Well, our boys are better off in heaven than here.
said Aunt Polly. Aunt Polly cried, and Tom felt awful,
My Joe was a good boy.
said Joe's mother.
He was always up to mischief, but he had a good heart.
Aunt Polly nodded, and she said between her cries,
My Tom was the same. I've been too strict with him recently. I even gave him medicine that wasn't fit for a cat.
Joe's mother then shook her head and said,
I haven't been nice to Joe either. I punished him for drinking cream that I had thrown out because it was sour. Now I'll never see him again. They must have drowned.
Aunt Polly said tearfully.
If they don't turn up by tomorrow, the pastor says we'll hold funerals for them on Sunday.
The two women cried. Tom almost cried too, but what his aunt had just said made him think. Soon the crying stopped, and Joe's mother said goodnight and left. Aunt Polly knelt beside her bed and prayed. Her prayers were full of kind words for her nephew. When Aunt Polly fell asleep, Tom looked at his aunt for a while. Then he bent down and kissed her on her cheek. Tom didn't leave the note because now he had a better idea. He rowed back to the island. When he arrived, he woke his fellow pirates and told them about his adventure. Joe asked lots of questions about his mother, and Tom patiently told his friends everything. But he kept his newest plan to himself. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 8, The Dead Return. After Tom had finished telling Joe and Huck about his trip to town, Joe and Huck were ready to go home. Even Tom was tired of playing pirates and swimming, but he simply wasn't ready to return. Sure, he was homesick, and he thought of Aunt Polly and Becky all the time. But Tom now had a plan to make his return home a grand entrance. It meant waiting a while longer, and it meant the other boys would have to wait too. Tom didn't want to tell his friends about his plan yet. He was afraid that even his amazing plan would not be enough to keep them on the island. So he had to keep them interested in their adventure a little longer, even though it wouldn't be easy. Tom saw that Joe was sad, so he tried to cheer him up.
Let's look for buried treasure again,
He said. But Huck and Joe didn't want to look for treasure again. Finally, Joe said,
Let's give up. I want to go home.
Oh
said Tom.
no! Just think of all the fishing here.
I don't care about fishing. I want to go home.
Said Joe, and he started to cry.
What a baby!
Teased Tom.
You miss your mother, I bet.
I do.
Said Joe.
And you'd miss yours too if you had one.
Tom became angry.
We'll let the crybaby go home, won't we, Huck?
Yes.
replied Huck sadly. Now Joe was angry.
Tom Sawyer, I'll never speak to you again for as long as I live. Who cares?
Said Tom.
Go home. You're not a very good pirate. Huck and I aren't crybabies. We'll stay, won't we, Huck?
Tom didn't really want Joe to leave, but he was too angry to think of how he could make Joe stay,
I want to go too.
said Huck quietly.
It's so lonely with just the three of us. If Joe goes, it'll be worse. Let's go too, Tom.
Huck put on his hat and got ready to leave. He looked at Tom and said,
Think it over. We'll wait for you by the raft.
Tom knew he was in trouble. His plan for a grand entrance was falling apart, and he couldn't think of a way to save it,
Wait forever if you want.
said Tom angrily.
But I'm not going with you. I'm staying here.
Joe and Huck began walking toward the raft. After a minute, Tom ran after them, shouting.
Wait! Wait! I want to tell you something.
Tom quickly told his friends about his idea. He promised that they could go home soon, just not today. Huck and Joe's spirits lifted.
Really? We'll go home on Sunday?
Asked Joe. Tom smiled and said,
Yes, on Sunday.
The boys dived into the river and played all day. That night they cooked and ate the rest of their food, and they retold the tales of their great adventure. Finally, Tom explained that on Sunday they would float across the river on a log so that no one would see them coming. Then they would sneak into church and hide under the large table by the entrance. On Sunday, the whole town gathered in the church for Tom, Joe, and Huck's funeral. Everyone knew the boys, and they were all quite sad. Becky was the saddest of all.
Being mad was silly.
She thought.
Now I'll never see Tom again.
Aunt Polly and Joe's mother were sitting in the front of the church, and they were both dressed in black. After the opening prayer and hymn, the minister spoke about the boys. He told many stories about their good deeds. When the minister finished speaking, everyone was crying, even the minister himself. Earlier that morning, the boys had hidden themselves under the table by the entrance of the church. They waited for the minister to finish his speech. Then they emerged from under the table. Tom proudly led his friends down the main aisle of the church. Everyone was shocked. Aunt Polly and Joe's mother shouted for joy, and they kissed the three boys wildly. Everyone else greeted the boys with relief and delight. The minister asked everyone to sing a hymn of thanksgiving, and the singing nearly took the church's roof off. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 9, Tom's Dream. The morning after the funeral, Aunt Polly's kisses stopped. At breakfast, she was angry.
Tom Sawyer, I cannot believe you were so hard-hearted. You made me and everyone else suffer for almost a week. You paddled on a log to come to your funeral. You could have at least come home and let me know that you weren't dead.
Tom looked away. He knew that his aunt had suffered because of him, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to forget it.
You should have let me know,
Continued Aunt Polly. Tom was sure that his guilty conscience was showing.
Tell me, Tom, that you would have come if you had thought of it.
Well, I don't know.
Stammered Tom.
It would have spoiled everything.
Oh, Tom, you break my heart.
Said Aunt Polly.
If you loved me, you would have come home. But all you care about are your ruined plans.
Tom's conscience was paining him greatly.
You know, Auntie, I care for you.
I'd know better if you acted more like it.
Answered his aunt in a hurt tone.
I did wrong.
Confessed Tom.
I should have thought of you. In any case, I did dream of you.
That isn't much.
Said Aunt Polly sadly.
But what did you dream about?
It was Wednesday night, and I dreamed that you and Joe's mother were sitting here.
Why, she was here.
exclaimed Aunt Polly.
What else did you dream about?
Oh, lots of stuff.
Said Tom.
But it's all kind of hazy.
Do try to remember.
Urged Aunt Polly.
Well, there was the wind. It blew.
Yes,
Said Aunt Polly excitedly.
the wind did blow something. What did it blow?
Tom pressed his fingers to his forehead and said,
It blew the candle.
Mercy!
exclaimed Aunt Polly.
That's right. Go on.
It's all coming back to me now.
Cried Tom.
You said I wasn't bad, and then you started to cry.
I did.
Said Aunt Polly.
Serenity Harper is going to hear about this before I'm an hour older. Go on.
Then Joe's mother started crying,
Tom continued.
and she said Joe wasn't bad either. She also wished she hadn't punished Joe for taking the cream when she was the one who had thrown it out.
Tom,
Cried Aunt Polly.
you were dreaming like a prophet.
Tom told his aunt everything. He didn't leave out a thing, and Aunt Polly was in awe. Finally, Tom said,
I think you prayed for me. I was sorry. So I wrote a note saying we weren't dead. I put it on your table, and then I kissed you.
I know it's only a dream, but I can forgive you now.
said Aunt Polly, hugging Tom. Sid thought the dream sounded too perfect to be a dream, but he kept his opinion to himself. When Tom was at school, Aunt Polly went to tell Joe's mother about the dream. At lunch, Tom came home to a very angry aunt.
I should skin you alive.
She said,
I ran over to Serenity Harper like an old fool. I told her about your amazing dream. She told me that Joe had told her you were here that night. It wasn't a dream at all.
Tom truly felt sorry for his joke. It had seemed like a good idea at breakfast, but now it just seemed mean.
You let me make a fool of myself. What kind of boy are you?
Asked Aunt Polly. Tom hung his head in shame.
Why did you come over that night? Did you come to laugh at our troubles?
She demanded,
No,
said Tom.
I came to tell you not to worry. I even wrote a note on a piece of bark. When I got the idea about the funeral, I put the note back in my pocket. But I did kiss you goodnight.
The hard lines on his aunt's face melted. The emotion in Tom's voice sounded too real for this to be a lie. After Tom returned to school, Aunt Polly wanted to see if she could find the piece of bark. She wondered if Tom really did write a note, or if this was just another one of his stories. Aunt Polly couldn't decide what to do, so she stood for several minutes debating with herself. Curiosity finally got the better of her. She went into Tom's room and looked around. Lying on the floor was the piece of bark, and on the back was Tom's note. As Aunt Polly read it, tears came to her eyes.
Now I can forgive Tom, even though he has committed 1,000,000 sins.
She murmured. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 10, Tom's Days of Glory. After the funeral, Tom was treated like a hero, and he loved it. At school, he knew everyone was watching him. The school children thought Joe and Tom were the greatest heroes in Petersburg, Missouri. Some even thought they were the greatest heroes in the whole state of Missouri. Tom had decided that he should be free of Becky because being a hero was better than love. His eyes, however, often betrayed him. He pretended not to see her, but his eyes followed her everywhere. Becky also decided to be free of Tom, but her eyes also betrayed her. When Becky saw Tom talking to Amy Lawrence, she felt a sharp pang in her heart. One day she tried to walk away, but her feet wouldn't obey, and she found herself standing next to Tom. She looked at Mary Austin and said,
Mary, why didn't you come to Sunday school yesterday?
I did come. Didn't you see me?
she replied.
Why, no.
Lied Becky,
Where did you sit?
I sat where I always sit.
answered Mary,
I saw you.
You did?
said Becky.
And Anyway, I wanted to tell you about the picnic.
What picnic?
asked Mary.
The one my ma's going to let me have.
Answered Becky.
She said I can invite anyone. Do you want to come?
Mary thought it was a great idea, so she agreed. Other boys and girls were soon asking to come, and Becky said yes to each one. The only ones who didn't ask were Tom and Amy. At lunch, Becky waited just outside the schoolhouse in case Tom wanted to say something then. But to Becky's surprise, Tom didn't ask about the picnic at all. This made Becky very upset. She was planning her revenge on Tom when she saw Alfred Temple spilling ink on Tom's spelling book. Becky was about to tell Tom, but then she changed her mind. If she didn't tell on Alfred, then Tom would be punished for the spilled ink. That would serve Tom right for his treatment of Becky. As Becky went back into the schoolhouse, she noticed that Mr. Dobbins had left a key on his desk. Mr. Dobbins was a schoolteacher who dreamed of being a doctor. When the students were busy reading or studying, Mr. Dobbins would open his locked desk and remove a book. Every child had a theory about what the book contained, but no one had actually seen its contents. Becky realized that this was her chance to read from the secret book. Swiftly, she unlocked the drawer and reached for the book. The title had something to do with anatomy, but that meant nothing to Becky. So she began to flip through the book and saw two colorful figures, a man and a woman. She was startled to find that both figures were completely naked. Just then, a long shadow fell across the teacher's desk. Somebody was at the door. In her haste to close the book and put it away, Becky tore a page. She turned to see who was there. It was Tom. She shouted at him.
Oh! You're so mean sneaking up on me like that!
I didn't know you were looking at something,
replied Tom.
Still, it's your fault I ripped a page. Now you're going to tell on me, and I'm going to be whipped. I've never been whipped at school before,
she cried. Tom wanted to say that he wouldn't tell, but Becky continued.
Be mean if you want, but you're going to be punished too for spilled ink on your book.
Tom could see that Becky was really afraid. When the teacher returned, Tom looked over at Becky. Her face was still full of fear and guilt.
Girls just can't lie like boys can,
thought Tom. The first lesson after lunch was spelling. Tom got whipped for the ink that had been spilled in his spelling book. Tom couldn't remember if he had or hadn't spilled the ink, and he protested loudly. After the spelling lesson, the teacher told them to read. Mr. Dobbins took out his own book. When he opened it, he noticed the tear and shouted,
Who ripped this page?
The students answered him with silence. So Mr. Dobbins began asking each student in turn. Tom noticed that Becky was becoming more and more anxious.
She's going to confess,
thought Tom. At last, the teacher said,
Becky Thatcher, did you tear this page?
I did it,
blurted out Tom. Every student was horrified. Tom Sawyer never admitted to anything. Tom took his whipping. When he got back to his seat, there was a note from Becky. You're so noble, it read. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 11, Muff Potter's Trial. At the beginning of summer vacation, everyone in town was talking about two things: the spectacular finale to the school's end-of-year recital and Muff Potter's trial. After his book had been torn, Mr. Dobbins became very quick-tempered, and he often used his whip on the children unjustly. Tom and the other schoolchildren had decided to get some revenge. Unknown to most of the town, Mr. Dobbins was bald. He hid his baldness with a wig. The plan was to expose Mr. Dobbins's baldness to the whole town. Tom thought the plan was good, but not good enough. He felt it needed something extra special. The night before the recital, Tom and several other boys slipped into the teacher's bedroom while he was sleeping. The boys knew that the teacher enjoyed several shots of whiskey before going to bed, and this made him a deep sleeper. The boys carefully painted Mr. Dobbins's bald head gold. The next evening, Tom asked Huck to help. During the recital, Huck cast his fishing line through the open window and snagged the teacher's wig. As the teacher was making his closing remarks, Huck reeled in his fishing line. The wig flew off and the teacher's gold head was exposed. Everyone agreed it was a historic ending to the recital. The other event on everyone's mind was Muff Potter's trial. Whenever anyone mentioned it, or the murder, chills ran down Tom's spine. One day, Tom went to Huck and asked,
Have you told anyone about what we saw?
Of course not,
replied Huck.
Why, Tom, we wouldn't be alive 2 days if that got out. Injun Joe would kill us.
Tom relaxed.
I guess we're safe as long as we keep quiet.
The boys promised again that they wouldn't say anything to anyone about Doc Robinson's murder.
Muff Potter is going to die,
said Tom.
He is,
replied Huck sadly.
Don't you feel sorry for him?
Asked Tom.
Yes,
Huck said.
Muff may be a drunk, but he isn't a murderer. He stood by me when I was out of luck.
He's fixed my kites plenty of times,
added Tom.
I wish we could get him out of trouble.
The only way to do that is to talk. But if we talk, we'll be dead,
said Huck. Tom and Huck did the only thing they could do to help Muff. That was to pass tobacco, matches, and other things to Muff through the window of his cell. Muff was grateful, but the visits only made Tom more depressed. On the day of the trial, the whole town gathered in the courthouse to watch. The prosecution called many witnesses to the stand, and none of them said anything good about Muff Potter. Even Muff's lawyer didn't defend him, and the prosecution was able to quickly build a solid case against him. The judge decided to break early for lunch. Tom knew that Muff would be hanged if he didn't say anything. He pulled Muff's lawyer aside as everyone was leaving the courtroom. Tom and the lawyer talked rapidly in hushed voices. When the trial resumed after lunch, the judge asked Muff Potter's lawyer if he had any witnesses that he wanted to call. The lawyer looked at the judge and said,
Yes, I would like to call Thomas Sawyer to the stand.
The courtroom buzzed like a hive of bees as everyone whispered. After the oath was administered, the lawyer asked Tom where he had been on the night of the murder. Tom was about to answer when he saw Injun Joe staring at him. Tom, suddenly afraid, stammered his answer.
I was in the graveyard.
Tom explained that he had been hiding behind the large tree near Hoss Williams's grave. The lawyer then showed the court the bag of Indian herbs that the boys had left behind. The courtroom was silent.
How close were you to the murder that you witnessed?
The lawyer questioned Tom.
I was about as close as I am to you, sir,
said Tom.
Can you describe to us exactly what you saw? Start at the beginning and don't leave anything out,
cautioned the lawyer. Tom started his story. It was hard to speak at first, but soon words began to flow. He described Doc Robinson knocking out Muff with a rock and continued.
I saw Injun Joe grabbing a knife and...
Suddenly there was a loud crash. Injun Joe was gone. He had jumped through the courtroom window. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 12, Summer Vacation. After the trial, Tom was a hero again. There was a story about him in the town newspaper. Old people loved him, and young people wanted to be like him. But Tom didn't feel like a hero because every night he was afraid to go to bed. In Tom's mind, a hero wasn't afraid of the dark. The fear wasn't so bad during the day when Tom could act like a normal boy. But his nights were horrible. Every night he had the same dream. Injun Joe was chasing him. In the dream, Tom ran, and then he fell. Every night he woke up screaming just as Injun Joe caught him. Huck was also afraid. Although Tom hadn't told anyone that Huck saw the murder, Huck was sure it would leak out. Every day, Huck and Tom asked the sheriff if Injun Joe had been caught. And every day the sheriff said,
No, not yet.
Huck and Tom were convinced that Injun Joe was waiting to get them. As the summer drifted along, the boys began to lose some of their fear. One day, feeling more confident, Tom went looking for someone to help him search for buried treasure. The only person he found was Huck.
Hey, Huck.
Said Tom.
Let's find some buried treasure.
Sure.
Said Huck.
Where will we dig?
You know, under the roots of old trees, on islands, and of course in haunted houses. We've already searched one island, so maybe we should look under some dead trees or in the haunted house.
Answered Tom.
Who hides treasure?
Asked Huck.
Robbers mostly.
Answered Tom.
If I were a robber, I wouldn't hide my treasure.
Said Huck.
I'd spend it right away and have a good time.
Me too.
Agreed Tom.
But if robbers weren't stupid, there wouldn't be any treasure for us to find.
The boys found an old pick and a rusty shovel, and they dug under and around lots of dead trees. But they didn't have any luck.
Maybe there are no robbers around here,
said Huck.
That's why we're not finding any treasure.
No, that's not it. We must be doing something wrong.
Tom thought for a while, and then he said,
I know what's wrong. We need to dig at night.
We need to dig at night?
Asked Huck.
Yes, treasure maps always say, when the moon is high in the sky, walk 40 paces and dig under the shadow of the biggest branch.
Answered Tom.
We need to dig again tonight.
Huck and Tom continued their search for buried treasure that night, but they still had no luck.
I don't understand,
said Huck.
We marked the shadows of the tree's biggest branches, and we still haven't found any treasure.
We didn't spot the shadows right at midnight,
Tom pointed out.
We've got to give this up, Tom,
said Huck. But Tom wasn't quite ready to abandon the idea of finding treasure.
There's still one place we can look, Huck.
No, Tom. I don't like haunted houses,
said Huck.
We won't look tonight,
said Tom.
Everyone knows that ghosts are dangerous at night. We can look in the haunted house tomorrow.
Well, okay,
answered Huck.
As long as you're sure that we won't see a ghost.
Have you ever heard of someone seeing a ghost during the day?
Asked Tom.
Well, no.
Huck seemed satisfied, so he agreed to meet Tom by the haunted house the next afternoon. As the boys walked back to town, they passed the haunted house. It stood alone in the middle of a moonlit valley, completely dark and evil-looking. The next day around noon, the two boys met at the haunted house. The house was still dark and dreary, but it no longer seemed as evil. Tom and Huck were about to enter the house when Huck suddenly asked,
What day is it today?
It's Friday,
answered Tom.
Did you say Friday?
Asked Huck.
I don't think we should go to the haunted house today.
Friday's an unlucky day to start a new enterprise.
Tom agreed. He suggested that they play Robin Hood instead. Huck didn't know who Robin Hood was, so Tom explained it to him. While the boys played, two pairs of sinister eyes watched them closely from the haunted house. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 13, Treasure and Terror in the Haunted House. On Saturday afternoon, Tom and Huck pushed open the creaky door of the haunted house. The house was very quiet. In the cracks of the stone floor, sickly-looking weeds were growing. The stone fireplace was crumbling, and cobwebs hung from every corner.
See?
Whispered Tom.
Haunted houses aren't so bad during the day.
Huck only nodded. The boys left their tools by the fireplace, and Tom led Huck up the stairs. The stairs were old and rotten in many places, but the boys had no problem climbing them. The boys searched a closet for hidden treasure, but they found nothing. Huck was getting ready to go down the stairs when Tom hissed,
Shh! Listen,
What is it?
asked Huck.
someone's coming.
Whispered Tom. The boys looked at each other in fear. Then they lay flat on the floor. Each peered through a knothole in the floorboards. 2 men entered the room below. One was a Spaniard whom the boys had seen around town. The boys had never seen the other man before. The men talked in whispers as they entered the house, but once they shut the door, they began to speak at normal volume.
It's dangerous.
Said the ugly, unshaven man to the Spaniard.
Dangerous?
Echoed the Spaniard.
I don't care. I want revenge.
The boys began to shake with fear. The voice of the Spaniard was Injun Joe's. Tom and Huck were both sure that when Injun Joe said revenge, he meant he wanted to get revenge on them,
I think it's dangerous.
argued the other man.
If you don't want to help,
Said Injun Joe.
you can wait for me up the river. I'll do the job, and then we'll be off to Texas.
I said I was your partner,
Said the ugly man.
so I'll help. I just wish we could have done it.
I know.
Interrupted Injun Joe.
Those darn kids were playing right outside the whole day, so we couldn't have left this house without being seen.
Have you got any food in your sack?
Asked the man.
I'm starving.
Injun Joe pulled some food out of his very large and very heavy sack, and the 2 men had lunch. Then they fell asleep. Tom and Huck started for the stairs, but the floorboards creaked and moaned with every step. They worried that the sleeping men would wake up, so they decided to remain upstairs. Injun Joe woke first, and then he woke his partner,
It's almost time.
Okay,
said the ugly man with a yawn.
but shouldn't we hide our loot here? $650 in silver is a lot to carry.
You're right.
Said Injun Joe.
Let's bury it deep.
Injun Joe pulled out his knife and began to dig in the dirt under the rotten floorboards. It wasn't long before Joe's knife struck something,
What did you hit?
asked his partner,
I'm not sure, but I think it's a box.
said Injun Joe. He reached his hand into the box and pulled out a handful of gold coins. Everyone in the house, the 2 men and the 2 boys, stared at the money.
I saw a pick in the corner by the fireplace. Let's find out how much there is.
Said the man excitedly. He grabbed the boy's pick, and Injun Joe used it to dig up the box.
There's over $10,000 here.
Said Injun Joe.
We're rich.
You won't need to do that other job now.
Said the other man. Injun Joe frowned and said,
It isn't just a robbery. It's also revenge. As soon as we're finished, we'll go to Texas.
Okay,
said the man.
the sooner we get the job done, the better. Should we bury the money again?
Injun Joe looked at the pick.
What's this doing here? It wasn't here yesterday.
He said. The 2 men looked at each other, and then Injun Joe pointed to the ceiling. Right away, the boys knew they were going to die. Injun Joe grabbed his knife and began to climb the stairs. The boys were sliding across the floor toward the closet when the stairs made a terrible droning noise. Then the stairs crashed down in a cloud of dust. Injun Joe was furious. When he got up from the collapsed stairs, his partner reminded him it was time to move out.
We'll be taking the treasure with us,
Said Injun Joe.
Naturally.
Said the man.
We'll take it to my hiding place and bury it in number 2 under the cross.
Said Injun Joe as they left. The boys were both happy and sad. They were happy to be alive, but depressed at having lost a chance to get $10,000.
We need to keep an eye out for Injun Joe.
Said Tom. Huck agreed.
If he comes into town, we should follow him to hiding place number 2.
Tom added. Then Tom and Huck walked back to town, dreaming of being rich. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 14, The Secret in the Tavern. That night, Tom dreamed vividly about the haunted house adventure. The next morning, he wasn't sure whether it had really happened. It seemed amazing that Injun Joe hadn't killed them, and it seemed just as amazing that $10,000 was hidden in the haunted house. After breakfast, Tom went into town. he saw Huck fishing by the ferry landing.
Oh, Tom, if we hadn't brought our tools into that house, we'd be rich right now,
cried Huck sadly.
So it wasn't a dream,
said Tom.
I thought maybe I made it all up. We've got to find that money,
he went on.
I don't know.
Huck wasn't so sure.
A man has but one chance in a lifetime to make it rich. We had our chance and we lost it, Tom,
he said.
We know Injun Joe is going to hide the loot in number 2 under the cross,
said Tom.
We've just got to figure out where number 2 is.
It could be a house number,
said Huck.
Not in this town,
said Tom.
Tavern rooms have numbers,
said Huck.
I didn't know that,
said Tom.
Hey, there are only 2 taverns in this town. You stay here and I'll be back quick.
When Tom returned, he told Huck what he had learned.
In the first tavern, room number 2 is rented by a young lawyer. In the other tavern, the tavern owner's son said room number 2 is a mystery. People only go in there at night, and it's always kept locked.
That's got to be the number 2 we're after,
said Huck.
Somebody has to watch that room,
said Tom.
There's a back door that goes out into the alley. That must be how Injun Joe comes and goes. You'll be the one to watch the back door, Huck. People will know something is up if I do it.
Huck still looked uncertain, but Tom finally talked him into watching the door. Tom said that if Huck watched the room, Tom could go into the tavern and look for the money. That seemed to satisfy Huck, and the boys parted with a handshake. After sunset, the boys met again in back of the tavern. They were hoping for a cloudy night, but instead the night was clear. The moon was too bright for Tom to sneak into the room without being seen. He told Huck to keep an eye on the place. The next few nights remained clear, so Tom went home while Huck watched. Finally, on Thursday night, clouds covered the moon. All week, Huck had seen no one coming or going, so just after midnight, Tom sneaked into the tavern. He went quietly up the stairs to the door. Huck tried hard to watch him, but the night was too dark. It was as if Tom had been swallowed by the night. Suddenly, Tom screamed,
Run for your life!
And he jumped over the railing of the stairs. Huck and Tom ran until they could hardly breathe.
What did you see?
Gasped Huck,
I nearly stepped on Injun Joe's hand!
said Tom, panting. Huck just stared at Tom, too scared to speak.
He was on the floor with his hands spread out. There was an empty bottle and a cup near his head.
He was drunk?
Asked Huck. Tom nodded.
Did you see the box?
Continued Huck. Tom shook his head and said,
There was no time. I just ran. I didn't see the box and I didn't see the cross. But I did see lots of barrels and bottles. I know the secret of that room. It's full of whiskey.
Huck thought about that for a moment and said,
You know, Tom, if Injun Joe is drunk, this would be a good time to get the box.
All right,
said Tom.
you try.
Huck shook his head.
You said there was only one empty bottle by his head. That isn't enough. If there were 3 bottles, then maybe I'd do it.
Well, there is one good thing that's come of this.
Said Tom.
We know where Injun Joe is. Now we just need to wait for him to leave, and we'll get in that room and search it properly.
Huck agreed to keep watch all night and sleep during the day.
We'll get this money yet,
he told Tom confidently. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 15, Lost. The day after Tom and Huck's adventure in the tavern, Becky reminded everyone that she was having a picnic. This interrupted Tom's thoughts. He stopped dreaming of Injun Joe, and he stopped dreaming of gold. The only thing he could think about was Becky and the picnic. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He stayed up, waiting for Huck to call. But Huck didn't call, so the next morning, a sleepy Tom joined the rest of the children at the ferry landing. As they were getting ready to board the ferry, Tom overheard Becky's mother tell her,
You'll be getting back late.
Why don't you stay with the Harpers tonight, near the landing?
When Tom heard this, he hatched a plan.
Becky,
He said,
let's spend the night at Widow Douglas's house instead. She'll have ice cream.
Becky was about to say no when Tom reminded her that her mother would never know. So she agreed. The ferry dropped the picnickers off at a spot about 3 miles from town. After they had eaten and played some games, somebody yelled,
Who's ready for the cave?
Everyone shouted.
Yay!
So candles were quickly provided and the children entered the cave. The cave was a confusing maze of twisting and turning tunnels, but most of the boys knew their way around a lot of it. After a while, the boys and girls returned to the cave entrance. Soon the ferry blew its whistle. Night was falling and it was time to go. The picnickers boarded the boat and amused themselves with tales of their adventures. No one noticed that Tom and Becky were missing. Meanwhile, Huck was watching the tavern. Huck was hiding deep in the shadows when he saw 2 men leave by the alley door. To Huck's surprise, one of the men seemed to be carrying a box under his arm. Huck was determined not to let the treasure escape him twice, so he followed the men. They headed toward the ferry landing and then a little out of town. They stopped near the Widow Douglas's house.
There are lights on,
Growled Injun Joe,
she must have company.
Maybe we shouldn't do this.
said the second man,
No way,
said Injun Joe.
I want revenge. Her husband horsewhipped me, but he died before I could...
Are you going to kill her?
Interrupted the other man,
I won't do any killing.
Kill? Who said kill?
answered Injun Joe. Huck had heard enough. He turned and slowly moved away. Once he was sure that he couldn't be heard or seen, he ran. Huck stopped at the first house he came to. It was the Welshman's house, and he banged on the door. As soon as the Welshman opened the door, Huck told him that Widow Douglas might be in danger. The Welshman and his sons grabbed their guns and ran into the night. Huck returned at dawn to learn what had happened.
Sit down, boy.
Said the Welshman.
First we'll have breakfast, and then we'll trade stories.
After breakfast, Huck learned that Injun Joe and his partner had gotten away, but that the box contained only thieves' tools. Huck told the Welshman almost everything he knew. The Welshman was shocked that he and his boys had almost captured Injun Joe. All through the morning, Huck stayed out of sight because he didn't want anyone to know that he was involved. The Welshman had a lot of visitors who wanted to hear the tale, and he told them. But he never mentioned Huck's name. Instead, he described a mystery man who had warned him of the crime. Soon the town was as curious about the mystery man as they were about the crime. But the Welshman wouldn't reveal Huck's identity. Although there was no Sunday school during summer vacation, the whole town gathered at the church. People wanted to hear more news about the thieves and the mystery man. Before long, a new mystery appeared. Where were Becky Thatcher and Tom Sawyer? No one knew. Judge Thatcher organized a search party and the group went to the cave. They looked for Becky and Tom for 3 straight days, but were unable to find them. The only thing they found was Tom and Becky's names written on the wall of the cave. While Huck was following the thieves and most of the town was sleeping, Tom and Becky had become lost in the cave. Tom was an experienced explorer, but while he was with Becky, he had forgotten to mark their path. When he realized they were lost, it was too late. Becky cried, and Tom did his best to comfort her. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 16, Gold. Tom and Becky had lost track of time. Their candles had gone out, and they both had fallen asleep. Had they slept long? Tom wondered. There was no way of knowing.
I'm so hungry.
Said Becky.
Here,
Tom passed her some cake.
I saved this for you.
Are people looking for us?
Asked Becky.
Sure.
Said Tom. But he knew the cave was big, and if he and Becky waited to be found, they might wait forever.
I think I should explore.
He said.
Here, hold one end of this kite string. I will go down these side passages as far as I can, and then I'll come back.
Becky was scared, but she agreed to Tom's plan. Tom crawled slowly into the dark, feeling in front of him like a blind man. He had only gone a short distance when he heard something. He gave a shout, and his voice echoed eerily throughout the cave. Then a light appeared. When Tom saw who was holding the light, he almost shouted again. The face in the light was Injun Joe's. Injun Joe looked just as scared to see Tom. He bolted away from him. When Tom crawled back to Becky, she asked him why he had shouted.
Just for luck,
said Tom. He didn't want to make Becky more afraid than she already was. Then he said,
I think I can find a way out, but I need some more luck.
He leaned forward and kissed Becky. Then he crawled down a different passage. Kissing Becky had indeed brought Tom some luck. Soon Tom saw light again, but this was a different kind of light, sunlight shining through a small hole. Tom took out his knife and gradually made the hole big enough to squeeze through. After Tom and Becky climbed out of the cave, Tom covered the hole with some leaves. He didn't want Injun Joe to find it and escape the same way. When Tom realized where they were, he exclaimed,
Gosh, we're 5 miles downriver from town. We walked almost 2 miles underground.
Tom and Becky walked to the river and got a barge that was headed upriver to stop for them. The crew on the barge had heard about the missing children, so they agreed to take them home. The town rejoiced, and then the 2 children were put to bed. Becky stayed in bed for almost 4 days, but Tom felt better after 2. Tom learned that Huck had been sick as well, so Tom went to visit his friend at the Welshman's house. When Tom and Huck were alone, Tom told Huck that he thought he knew where the treasure was. Huck shook his head and said,
It isn't in the tavern, Tom.
Tom wanted to interrupt his friend, but Huck was talking too fast.
When I was sick,
said Huck,
I dreamed a lot, and I guess I did a lot of talking. I talked about the tavern, I talked about Injun Joe and the murder, and I talked about the widow Douglas. The Welshman and others figured things out and searched the tavern, but all they found was whiskey.
Tom smiled.
Of course. That's all they found because the gold is in the cave. I saw Injun Joe in the cave.
The night you were found, Judge Thatcher blocked the cave entrance with an iron door,
said Huck.
He didn't want what happened to you and Becky to happen again.
Tom wanted to go to the judge. But the widow Douglas, who had been taking care of Huck at the Welshman's house, wouldn't let Huck go. So Tom went by himself, and then headed back to the cave with the judge and the sheriff. The judge opened the great iron door with his key. Inside, they found Injun Joe lying dead on the ground. His knife was broken at his side where he had tried to chip his way out. The next day, Tom got Huck. They borrowed a rowboat and Tom rowed downriver. Tom found his secret entrance to the cave easily. They each lit a candle and entered. Tom showed Huck where he and Becky had slept, and then he led Huck to where he had seen Injun Joe. They climbed down into the chamber. Tom and Huck both noticed the large cross on the wall, and they immediately started digging. They didn't have to dig long before they came to a board. They lifted the board, and under it was a small compartment. Inside the compartment were some candles, some matches, and a box full of silver and gold.
Finally!
Exclaimed Huck.
We found the treasure!
Even when money's free,
said Tom.
You still have to work for it.